Next, we'll have Elif Sarican, who is a Kurdish women movement activist, writer, and anthropologist. I believe she's here with us from Palestine today. Yeah, the floor is yours, Elif. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I want to begin by just remembering everyone affected by the recent horrific earthquake in Kurdistan, Syria, and Turkey. Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine what it's like, of course, to be there, but also I can't even begin to explain the level of neglect, particularly areas where ethnic and faith minorities are based, which is the epicenter of the earthquake. I also want to remember on this International Women's Day occasion those who have been resisting for many, many decades and centuries before us, and who continue to do so in the dungeons of fascist states, in the mountains, on the streets. And I also want to particularly pay my respects to the sacrifice of Jina Amini, Sakine Cansız, Leyla Şailemez, Fidan Doğan, who were brutally assassinated by Turkish intelligence in the center of Paris 10 years ago. Nagahan Akarsel, who was assassinated in Süleymaniye in South Kurdistan just in October, and Evin Goyi, who was brutally murdered in the center of Paris yet again in December. And when we remember all those who have resisted and continue to resist, I think it's also important to remember the roots of International Women's Day on 8th of March, and its roots, you know, from the 19th century of the resistance or the struggle of migrant workers in New York. And I think it's important to remember this, to understand that the roots of this day is anchored in anti-capitalist class struggle and by migrant workers, especially demanding bread but also roses. And I think that connects us well to the call of the Kurdish women's movement on this International Women's Day. The Kurdish women's movement for many years has exercised the occasion of International Women's Day to announce campaigns, to announce new stages of struggle, and to also make declarations, not just to Kurdish women, but to the women of the region, and of course to the women and people of the world. And this year, they have declared that we are walking to women's revolutions with Jinjian Azadi. And some have said before me the roots of Jinjian Azadi and what that slogan means. So I won't repeat that. But I think it's important to understand not just the roots of Jinjian Azadi, but Jinjian Azadi as a slogan, as a philosophy, is rooted itself in that it has been developed over years and years struggle. It has very strong roots in the area of struggle that it comes from, and it has very strong roots in the revolutionary tradition that it has been developed in particular of the Kurdish women's movement's struggle, not just against the nation state, capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, but also in a broad sense in the struggle for life, you know, in the struggle for radical democracy, for ecology, and for women's liberation. And I think, of course, many of us, we make no mistake that the current situation or the current phase that we are living is not an easy one. It's not all roses. We are, of course, are all aware of that, and we are aware that there are many struggles, many risks, many difficulties, many real forms of fascism that not just, of course, women, but people are facing all across our region and all across the world. But I think what's important to understand that, of course, there's a lot of downturn in the developments of the world, and actually many of our gains until now, particularly in terms of women's struggle, are also not guaranteed. But there's also a shift in the way people are feeling and people are relating to the systems around them. And I think we are seeing this in particular, of course, right now in Iran. Iran is perhaps not the first place where there has been a women's revolution. We know about Rojava, but it is one of the first places that the whole of society is rallying behind a slogan of women's revolution. And I think that's a very important that's a very important point to understand. We've seen the whole of society rally behind and march with the slogan, and not just against the regime in Iran, but also for a better life, particularly in a non-sectarian way. And I think that's also an important development as well. And I think what we see, or the unfoldings around the world, what we see is that it demonstrates the strengthening of the likelihood, particularly as the Kurdish women's movement has declared, that the 21st century will be a century of women's revolutions. And I mean that in the plural sense. So not just one revolution, not just a destination, not just an event, but many women's revolutions, in that we rally behind a alternative and a new and more beautiful world. And this is, of course, from, Abiy Yala. We were all very inspired by the uprisings in Sudan a few years ago. And of course, our sisters, who I can't even perhaps imagine the level of struggle by our sisters in Afghanistan, and of course Kurdistan and Iran's uprisings. And I think what we're seeing is that communities, societies, and many people are gathering around women's leadership. Women's leadership in terms of women actually physically leading, but women's leadership also in terms of the principles and the values that many people are calling for. And, particularly those who, want or crave freedom, democracy, and justice that is rooted in freedom. And I think, again, more and more people, of course, across our region, but across the world, are understanding the violence and the bankruptcy of particularly the nation-state system. We see this, of course, in the uprisings of some of the places we've mentioned, but also in many parts of Europe and the West in general as well, in people, rising up and talking about the bankruptcy, or perhaps the necessity to deem borders obsolete as well. And I think that's important to remember on International Women's Day, the violence of the way the borders are upheld also across Europe as well, and of course other parts of the world. And I think what people are also understanding is that colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism are foundational to the systems that are upheld by, I guess, what we can call the enemies of life, and calling for, of course, a political change, but as has already been mentioned, a social and societal transformation, and understanding that none of it is complete unless they coexist together. System, political change, but of course also social change. Now, I think, I want there to be time for everyone else, but I think finally what I will say is, we're seeing these developments, but also we are seeing the further, the further fascism of many states, including the Turkish state, the Iranian state, and other parts of the world. And there seems to be opportunities in the coming years, but these opportunities are not inherent. The gains we have are not inherent. From the co-chair system to uprisings to calling for alternatives, this only happens, and as we organize. I think there's something to say to, of course, spontaneous developments, but I think most of the time, if we look at it, most of the time these developments are not spontaneous. They take labor, they take work, and they take time in organizing and mobilizing people around us. And for anything to be, of course, lasting and long-term change and freedoms for it requires for us all to organize. It requires for us all to rally around common principles and a common struggle. And some people tuning in today, or some people who are in the room, the London room today, perhaps will remember the conference led by the Kurdish women's movement in Berlin in November, with the slogan of World Women's Democratic Confederalism. The call is that with all our differences, with all our diversities, we must come together as a beautiful mosaic to change the world together, and bring not just, of course, women, but the whole of society with us, and stamp the 21st century as the century of women's liberation. Thank you.